I'm Colin Sanders, and you're listening to the History Books Review. I read history books and I review them. Could Julian the Apostate have defeated Christianity? Julian has continued to fascinate people down the ages. He tends to be viewed favourably. In life, he must have had a lot of charisma to do many of the things he did, and he's left enough of his own writing, and there are enough eyewitness accounts that you can feel that you have got to know him. He's talented, engaged, idealistic, and with a great sense of humour. He's very likeable. Add to that a hero's death and an against-the-odds struggle against history, and he becomes irresistible. But there seems to be an almost universal consensus that he was somehow doomed to fail. The forces he was opposing were simply too strong, and ultimately the things which Julian cared about were beyond saving, even by someone as talented as him. Julian loathed the Christians. He described them as a sect of fanatics, despicable to mankind and odious to the gods. And their ultimate triumph has given that triumph an air of inevitability. Julian was brave, but he was trying to do the impossible, and so all his efforts were, in the end, nothing more than a futile gesture of despair in the face of inevitable defeat. I am not so sure that Julian can be condescended to quite so easily. In a very short reign he gave the church one heck of a scare. Had he lived longer, it is quite likely he would have broken its political influence completely. Paganism was not remotely moribund, and with the reforms Julian planned, including switching state-sponsored charity from the church to the temples, it could well have emerged strong enough to halt the growth of Christianity and even push it backwards. It's instructive to look at how easily Christianity was later to decay in its heartland of Egypt and Syria under Islam. All it took was a higher rate of tax on the Christians to turn them from a clear majority to a tiny minority. Julian lost and the church won, but it could very well have been luck rather than any inherent virtue of the Christian position. Let's assume that Julian had not been killed in Persia and returned able to claim success. He had created the bond with the Eastern legions like the one he had already done with the Western ones, and he was ready to go. Let's assume that he rules for another 30 years, giving him a reign comparable to that of Constantine. His military abilities keep the empire together, and his grip on the army makes his position secure. What would he be likely to do? My feeling is that he would avoid outright confrontation with the Christians, while continuing to come up with minor restrictions and controls that don't make their lives impossible, but which limit their scope. Julian had already started moving down this track. He'd enacted legislation to prevent Christians from being teachers. It was quite a complicated and rather crafty bit of legislation. It simply meant that Christians weren't allowed to use the pagan texts, which were the standard ones for the time. This was not the kind of measure that would provoke a riot, but it would reduce the attractiveness of the cult to the influential group of society who goes on to become qualified and become administrators. Fines for prior damage to pagan buildings was another neat trick he had up his sleeve. If you joined a particular church, you might find yourself personally liable for repairing the previous vandalism of the Christians against pagan monuments. It would be much cheaper not to get associated with them in the first place, or to distance yourself if you'd already got involved. He was also well on the way to reforming and overhauling paganism, giving it a centralised command structure. With state patronage, the pagan organisations could have started to provide welfare services much as the church did. That would strengthen their prestige. It would also give the government a handy tool for development. It would be easy to use a structure like this to bond, say, barbarian settlers within the empire. It also makes pagan religious practices an attractive career option for ambitious Romans. How does Christianity cope with a situation like this? It's hard to see what response it could possibly make. It would be faced not so much with a direct challenge as a steady weight dragging it down. Relatively few people want to be martyrs, and most people just go with the flow, so that would be quite an effective strategy. But there are some people who court death for the cause they believe in. Could a bloody persecution have rebounded to the Church's advantage? Could the courage and dignity of the Church's martyrs in the face of persecution have the effect of making the Church more attractive? Martyrs are, in my opinion, the most overrated class of humans in history. They are few in number and their motives are rarely understandable. The idea that the early Christian martyrs inspired people to join up is a deep-seated one and may have been true in some cases, but we only have Christian sources to confirm it. On the whole, it seems unlikely. The same story is told of Protestant martyrs in English history, but there were Catholic martyrs as well, and they don't seem to have had the same effect. Admittedly, there were fewer of them, but surely they ought to have inspired some followers. A massacre of Christians might have shown enough dignity to win more converts, but it has to be said that it's hard to think of any well-documented examples where this has happened for any cause. In fact, in the later history of the Empire, bloody disputes between Christians were common, and in those cases, bloody persecution worked pretty well as a way of enforcing orthodoxy. In any event, while Julian was alive, he was studious to avoid creating martyrs, whether from principle or calculation, or a combination of both. He was also a quick learner, so if he had switched to a more robustly anti-Christian policy, he would no doubt have monitored the effects and modified them accordingly. So whatever he did, it was likely to have been effective. But whether effective or counterproductive, direct persecution wasn't the only tool in his pack anyway. As the emperor, his powers of patronage were enormous. If he was unwilling to use the stick, he had plenty of carrot to use as well. So even if the Church was well entrenched, there was every chance that Julian could turn it back. In fact, I think the biggest assumption that people make is the one that is the most wrong. It simply wasn't the case that Christianity had any superior qualities over paganism. The biggest weakness of Christianity has always been that it is basically not very well thought out. It's a hodgepodge of beliefs from a number of sources, with a confusing central dogma that was basically cobbled together to meet the particular political needs of Constantine at one point in time. It's been patched up a bit over the centuries, and some highly respectable brains have done their best to try and get it to make some sense. In the short run, this rarely matters very much. As any salesman will tell you, the trick is to sell the sizzle and not the sausage. With good organisation and not too much competition, Christianity does just fine. But it is always vulnerable to heresies, splits and schisms, simply because it's so easy to look at the Holy Canon and come up with your own interpretation. The history of Christianity is pretty much the history of its fragmentation. The early church was split between the Arians and the Orthodox, with smaller breakaway groups in abundance. The split between the Catholics and the Orthodox was protracted, but was complete by the 11th century. The Protestants broke away from the Catholics in the 15th century, modifying the Bible in the process. As recently as the 20th, we've seen the evangelicals creating yet another new version of Christianity which is at odds with the rest of them. At the time of Julian, none of this mattered too much, because the pagans were even more fragmented, and in fact generally only worried about their own locality. But Julian's Neoplatonic framework offered a solution to this. If there is one true transcendent God who created all the lesser gods, including all the regional ones, then there is no need for a conflict between different cults, and they could logically be united within a single framework. This was clearly Julian's plan, and he had already laid down what he expected from the official priestly caste he had intended to create. A state-sponsored pan-pagan union would have all the advantages of the Christian Church, and would be quite likely to avoid the schisms. Julian was quite capable of finding the men he would need to write up a set of doctrines to fit his new conception of the old religion. His own writings could well have become part of the canon themselves. So, to my mind, Julian was not just an enemy of Christianity, he was the enemy. He was the one man in history who could have stopped it. If he had succeeded, much that was lost might have been saved. There is no reason why the great pagan statues and monuments of the ancient world could not have been preserved to this day. Much more of the literature of the classical age would have survived. Remember that we only know about the atomic theory of the Greeks by a handful of manuscripts. Some of Cicero's writings only survived because the parchments were reused for standard ecclesiastical texts, leaving tiny residues on the originals below that could be read. The influence of Christianity on the development of Western thought and culture has been huge and about as negative as it's possible to imagine. I can't believe that even the most devout church-going enthusiast hasn't at some point in time wandered round an art gallery and thought, not another crucifix. Christianity is very short of good stories. The story of Jesus himself is not only not very inspiring, it isn't even particularly easy to work out what, if anything, it's supposed to mean. The cathedrals are impressive, they're great monuments and most people like them, but a big building is a big building and it's really a monument to stonemasonry rather than the religion that supposedly inspired it. Above all, I think retaining paganism would have kept us closer to our roots. Christianity has wiped out much of our traditional culture. A good example is, I'm writing this on a Wednesday. The name of the day preserves the name of Woden, but about him most of us know next to nothing. This is a huge shame. When there are major national occasions or significant events in your life, a local religious site very naturally provides a focus for that kind of thing. But the dogmatism of Christianity is a huge barrier to us non-believers and to unorthodox believers. What I really envy is the Japanese and their national religion of Shinto. That's a sort of model of the kind of national paganism I would like to have, one that's all-encompassing and deeply rooted rather than divisive. I don't doubt that Julian's pagan church would have had many of the same problems as the church went on to have. It would have been a source of power, and power breeds problems and corruption. The priests would no doubt have lined up with the most conservative elements in society and pursued their own interests. In this alternative version of history, Christianity never gets into the position to do all the things like the Crusades and the Inquisition that have given it such a bad name. It's hard to imagine Julian's reformed paganism being much worse, but it would probably still have been pretty bad. Julian might be remembered not so much as a man who saved us from Christianity, but as a man who wrecked the toleration of early paganism. But the reality was that once the fanaticism had emerged, it had to work itself out in some way. It wasn't inevitable that Christianity would triumph, and the emergence of Islam, which now occupies much of the area where Christianity first spread, proves this. But once the meme of highly organised, fanatical, centralised religions had developed, the choice was a stark one. Adapt to the new environment, as Julian tried to do, or be wiped out, as actually happened. It was Darwinian selection, and you either grew teeth or got eaten. But I believe it would still have been better if paganism rather than Christianity had triumphed. The Dark Ages would have been less dark and less long. Less blood would have been spilt, and we would have a lot more of our culture left. We wouldn't have realised how close we came to losing it all, but that's the nature of history. Ultimately, what if questions like this are pretty futile, and we can never know how things would have turned out if events had been different. But there is one thing that a successful restoration of paganism would have achieved, I am pretty sure. Julian is known as Julian the Apostate, as a deliberate slur by his enemies. But his admirers have coined the alternative name of Julian the Philosopher. I'm pretty confident that had he survived, that is the name we would call him today. He would have liked that.